Gotta say, guys, I've been waiting a long time for this one. Now, off rip, you guys are going to notice a bit of a difference with this one. Whether it be the title card or the formula or, the actual color this time. The red first letter that every other YouTuber thought they were original for doing. That's because this episode is going to be a bit different. As I said before, the series follows a comparison format as opposed to a number or a letter or some kind of fractional grading system like a out of 5 or out of 10 or whatever. Because I feel like when you do the whole number or letter thing, you set yourself up for a slew of comments about how your opinions are inconsistent because, you gave a game they didn't like a really good score, or you gave a game that they really liked a bad score. It's a mess. It's always a mess, and I'd rather just avoid it. I want people to actually watch and retain my reviews as opposed to latching on to whatever arbitrary grading system I choose to implement in the end. Because once you do that, that's all anyone remembers. So anyway, what does that explanation have to do with this review? Well, the last game I reviewed was Animal Crossing New Horizons, and the only two games I can think of more incomparable than Animal Crossing and Resident Evil are Heavy Rain and Tongue of the Fat Man. And since Resident Evil 2 2019 is actually the game that inspired this entire series last year, we'll get into why and how later. I've decided to make this a review and comparison between both titles, what one does differently than the other, with a few comparisons to the original source material as well. So let's get... Wait, you've never? You've never played a single Resident Evil? Huh. Too often do these videos assume that the person viewing them is already savvy when it comes to the subject matter. And rightfully so. There are multiple videos on here from multiple sources breaking down the entire Resident Evil timeline chronologically in great detail. But hey, why would I send you to any of them when I can make this video longer by explaining it myself and increasing the chances of YouTube's algorithm working in my favor? So for the sake of not talking your ear off even longer than I intend to, we're going to be breaking down the original trilogy of games, all of which have been remade. So we're going Resident Evil 2002, Resident Evil 2 from 2019, and Resident Evil 3 from 2020. Also, there's stuff that happens before and after, and even in between these games via animated films, spin-off games, and even novelizations. But for this video, we're sticking to the original but remade, but the first three, but also most recent original remakes of the past now in the then future that is now the present. So anyway, Resident Evil's story begins before the games even. It's usually wrongfully crowned the originator of the survival horror genre, and that isn't necessarily true. It's definitely popularized the genre and revolutionized video games as a whole in the late 90s, but without titles like Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark to draw inspiration and aesthetics from, I'd go as far as arguing that Resident Evil would probably still exist, but it definitely would not be the groundbreaking title that it was in 1996. Fast forward to 2002, and the game is remade almost entirely from the ground up, but the story, as follows, remains pretty much unchanged. So, it's survival horror. The survivor being you, the player, the horror being the zombies. Mostly. Thematically, Resident Evil as a whole, or at least the first three entries in particular, have one central theme at their core. It's about overcoming seemingly impossible odds in the face of seemingly unstoppable evil for the sake of doing what's right. It's a tale about the consequences of corporate greed and the thankless altruism of relatively small and insignificant individuals that ends it all. It's a theme that carries over from the first to third game in pretty clear-cut ways, and it's something that the remakes do pretty well. So in Resident Evil 2002, you start the game with the option to choose between our two heroes, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. You're investigating a series of grisly murders in the fictional Arklay Mountains just outside the fictional Midwestern mountain town of Raccoon City, where Chris and Jill are active members of an elite division of the Raccoon City Police Department, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS for short. The reason they send you in at all is because these attacks have persisted for months, and they aren't just affecting hikers anymore. Now the various mountain homes that are sprawled out across the range. Investigations have fruited little to no conclusive information, no witnesses, and no suspects. So Police Chief Brian Irons sends STAR's Bravo team to investigate, only for Alpha Team and leading characters Chris and Jill to have to swoop in and rescue them after an engine failure in Bravo Team's helicopter. They find the downed helicopter, but no Bravo Team, no bodies. Survival equipment still intact and untouched inside. Without spoiling much else, let's just say they run into the reason they can't find Bravo Team. Their helicopter pilot straight up abandons them, which we'll get into later. And with everyone else presumed dead, the remaining 4 STARS members, Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, Albert Wesker, and Barry Burton, make haste towards the only secure location in sight, the legendary, the illustrious, the infamous Spencer Mansion, where pretty much the entire first game takes place. Going any further into detail about any of this will probably ruin the game for anyone who hasn't played it, so I'm not going to do that because it is so damn good. It is one of the best remakes ever made as far as video games ever. Everyone should pick up this game and give it at least one playthrough. If you have a working GameCube and a retro game store near you, I recommend getting the original port and playing this game as intended by the developers for the full experience. But if that stuff's not super important to you, you can always get Resident Evil Origins Collection for like 20 bucks tops on PS4 or Xbox, and play it in full HD with the added bonus of Resident Evil 0 packed in with it, just in case you end up falling in love with the series and you want to get some prequel action. Anyway, that's the basic gist of the first game without spoiling too much of its events. Now moving on to a game that has almost nothing to do with the first one. We have
Resident Evil 2.
I say almost nothing because the only similarities between the two are the aesthetics, the mechanics, and the enemy types to an extent. It's the same theme and subject matter, but the two stories hardly ever explicitly connect. The characters, the setting, the story, and the pacing are noticeably different this time around. Mostly because these remakes are over a decade apart, and there's obviously going to be some technical and mechanical differences in a couple games that are 17 years apart. Everybody good? We all understand how time works? Great. So Resident Evil 2 sees us taking control of either rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy, who is supposed to be reporting in for his first day on the job, or college student and motorcycle enthusiast Claire Redfield, Chris's younger little baby-ass little sister. So the two of them ride into Raccoon City on the same night for separate reasons, completely oblivious to the events taking place there. Get this. Turns out, the same thing that killed all those hikers and mountain people in the Arclays made its way to the neighboring Raccoon City, and it's wreaking total, irreversible, inconceivable havoc on its population. One thing leads to another, and they both end up in various parts of Raccoon City, keeping sparse communication with each other and running into each other on occasion. Well, one occasion, which really pissed me off. Anyway, the whole game happens, and they find out that this is actually bigger than either of them, uncovering a huge conspiracy involving military contracts, government secrets, bioorganic weapons, pharmaceutical companies, and corporate espionage. But they're both determined to get to the bottom of this and destroy whatever caused the horrific events that led to the ruin of Raccoon City. A year later in real life, we get the Resident Evil 3 remake. And where 1 and 2 hardly have anything to do with each other explicitly, 3 ties into both 1 and 2 rather seamlessly, in my opinion. Once again, we meet up with our protagonist Jill Valentine, who is knee-deep in connective tissue between the events of the Spencer Mansion and the elected officials, bureaucrats, and politicians that run Raccoon City. Upon arriving back from that horrible and traumatic experience, STARS, once considered the elite and most respected division in the RPD, become the laughingstock of the force after no one believes their retelling of the Spencer Mansion events. But it's all fun and games until Jill and Brad Vickers specifically are caught at the very start of the outbreak in Raccoon City and are forced to fend for themselves amidst the city's unwillingness to prepare for the inevitable. Now you fucked up.
Now you fucked up! You have fucked up now!
So just like in 2, Raccoon City is the setting, and we follow our protagonist from 1 in a perfect tie-in between all 3 games. One thing leads to another. As stated before, the game happens, and Jill makes it out of the city and swears to dedicate the rest of her life to destroying Umbrella, the evil corporation that caused all this. Okay, so before we move on, I usually don't spoil stuff in these reviews because it's pretty easy to talk about what I like and dislike about a game without mentioning specific story beats or important playthrough components, but these 2 games have very specific similarities that kind of depend on spoilers for me to communicate effectively. So if you don't want to get spoiled, exit the video now. Don't watch the rest. It's okay. It's okay. I understand. You don't have to watch the rest, and I still love you. I still love you. If you don't mind spoilers, stick around. It's gonna get good, I promise. Now, beyond this point, I will be operating under the assumption that my audience has either played both of these games or does not care to be spoiled. So if you're here because you want to know whether or not you should give these remakes a try, the short answer is yes. Absolutely. You can click out of the video now. I'm not thirsty for views, and I know you all love and support me. Side note, I will never make y'all feel like you owe me a subscription. A lot of YouTubers and content creators on here get a little too in their feelings about subscriber count.
The problem is we're getting a consistent amount of views of every single episode, but 52% of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. Why not? It's not going to change how much I show up. It's literally going to make no impact on your life at all.
I don't know. It's kind of pathetic, and I respect you guys too much for all that. Anyway, this section isn't going to be anywhere near as long as the last, but I figured it made sense to put it here because, well, it didn't really make sense to put it anywhere else. And once I get going with my opinion on these two games, I kind of want to stay on track. So one point I'd like to make is that I played the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 respectively as a kid on my uncle's PlayStation at my grandma's house, but I never finished them. He didn't have a memory card because we was broke, and as an adult in 2020, here to tell you that no amount of charm or aesthetic is ever gonna change my mind about tank controls. Tank controls are fucking stupid. They are stupid. You tank control purists, right, and your immersion bullshit are fucking dumb, and you need to let go of the past, all right? My favorite Resident Evil game is Resident Evil 4, but you will never catch me arguing in favor of the clunky ass controls based on some fucking immersion or tension argument. No, them controls are clunky as shit. They always have been, and there's no getting around it. The game is great, right? But you gotta admit that the controls are often unreliable and they just like don't hold up sometimes. It's okay. Grow up. So why am I doing this? I could just focus on RE3. I could make my life way easier. But the reason I'm doing this is because Resident Evil 2 Remake is the whole reason I started this segment, actually. That's right. A year and a half ago, I bought Resi 2. Day one. For over a month, I played both scenarios for both characters, tried hardcore difficulty, and just didn't have the patience. Played Fourth Survivor with Hunk, unlocked all the tofu, and thought, man, you know, I've been having so much fun with this game. Maybe I should do a thing where I like review it or revisit it after a month, and thus 1 month later was born. Now, while I always meant for RE2 to be the first review I ever did in this style, it never actually happened, and that's never sat right with me because RE2 earned a place in my top 10 games of all time, and I've always wanted to communicate that. So is this just me shoehorning RE2 into an RE3 review because I'm salty that I didn't get to review it when the time was right? Yeah. In this section, we're going to compare our protagonists. We're going to focus on Leon and Claire from 2 and Jill and Carlos from 3. So we're going to do one pair first and then the second while comparing them both. Okay, so Leon and Claire. Upon your first playthrough of 2, you're going to come into this as a brand new experience. You're going to excuse a lot of their naivety because you're kind of in the same boat. But for two people thrust into the literal apocalypse alone, who are seemingly brought together by fate itself, they have all the chemistry of two wet socks that don't match. And this is even more evident by how little the story actually tries to make their campaigns intertwine. I guess the developers couldn't rewrite the game in a way that wouldn't contradict itself, so they just kept it the same. The only problem is that Claire ends up in the exact same situations as Leon, so the canon is unclear as to how the story actually goes now. In the original game from 1998, the widely accepted, if not official canon was Claire A scenario and then Leon B scenario. Hold on, I'm gonna show you. So this is an original copy of the game, right? So back in the day, the way it worked was you would pop in one character's disc, right? This disc had Claire's playthrough on it. This disc had Leon's. The established canon was Claire A, Leon B. And the way that worked was pop in Claire's disc first, beat the game completely, create a new save file, take this disc out, and replace it with Leon's disc so that you would then access his B scenario, and then load up the save file from before that you made after you beat it as Claire. Then you'd beat it as Leon all over again and unlock the true ending. The characters themselves were also more like real people. They had plenty of personality, tenacity, and steadfastness. But I'm not going to get hung up on that and instead hold these characters up based on their own merits. It's annoying when people get all Puritan about these things. Like, it's 2020, sis. Like, this is what we got, and if you don't like it, you come up with something other than, oh, they change stuff and I don't like change. Like, it's fine if you don't want to adapt to the telephone. You're just gonna feel real stupid when you're the only one sending telegrams and have nobody to talk to. Look, all in all, Leon and Claire are barely people in the remake. Leon is a gullible Boy Scout and Claire is way too willing to jump right into the mouth of madness for a completely untrained college girl who's just like looking for her brother. And it's not a matter of what's realistic or not. Y'all have no idea how much I hate people who argue real world physics in fictitious media. I am sick of the fucking boulder joke. Yes, Chris punched a boulder. We all know he punched a boulder. It's not funny anymore. But you know what? If Wesker can cheat death like 4 fucking times, regenerate like a fucking reptile, and literally teleport, I believe Chris is capable of punching a fucking boulder. Because it's not about what's realistic, okay? It's about what's believable. And in the context of the game and the universe that the game sets up for me and the logic of the in-game universe, Leon and Claire just aren't as believable as our next set of protagonists. Now here comes some fun motherfuckers, man. My God, Jill Valentine and Carlos Oliveira. Ugh, such a... You hear the ethnicity in that fucking name, bro. They're great. I love them so much. They're so great. Remember what I said about Leon and Claire not feeling like real people? Well, Jill and Carlos are the exact opposite of this. And I have a much better time believing their brazen behavior because they're both trained professionals. Jill has dealt with this before. Carlos works for the company that caused all this. Jill is a no-nonsense, battle-hardened cop on a mission, and Carlos is the sexy, beautiful, attractive, hunky, smooth-talking merc.
I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
With a big-ass gun and a jaw like a fucking anvil. And that hair? Whew. Hold on, it's getting hot in here. What was I talking about? You know, I didn't see any other YouTuber mention this, probably because 90% of YouTubers that the algorithm favors are white men, and they don't make content with literally anybody else in mind but other white men. But despite what some white male YouTuber with no ethnic friends thinks about him,
Carlos has stupid hair.
I really appreciate Carlos's redesign. In the original RE3, Carlos's name could have been Harold fucking McIntyre, and literally no one would argue. In the remake, he fucking looks like a fucking Carlos way. And I'm not sure if this was intentional, but sometimes his Latino twang shows up in his mannerisms and his vernacular.
You stay on the door. I got this fucker.
He's a big, stubbly brown man with big ethnic hair, and I just love seeing that shit. I don't care what anybody says. This is so important, stupid hair or not. Playing as him is a treat, and listening to either Jill or Carlos talk is great, because their one-liners are fantastic, and their chemistry is leagues better than Leon and Claire's. They say shit I would say if I was in the same predicament.
All right, you want me to keep out? I'll keep out. Well, if cameras killed those things, I'd be set. Now here's a weird fucking door.
It's a nice improvement, and it adds a layer of believability. What's more, these characters are actually likable. Wow. Jill feels a little underdeveloped, and aside from 2 scenes depicting a nightmare sequence, telling us that the events of the Spencer Mansion still haunt her and she can't sleep because of it does almost nothing for her as a character, since it doesn't carry over into the gameplay in an interesting way at all. It just feels like something that was thrown in for more scary imagery as opposed to something substantial. Jill's PTSD would have made for like a great gameplay mechanic somehow. Like, you know, too many close encounters with too many zombies could like induce like a Silent Hill-esque or a Clock Tower-esque kind of like panic mode or something like that. I don't know. Something like that would have been cool, I guess. But I don't know. Would that have been cool? Let me know in the comments. Overall, the characters serve their purpose well enough in each title, but now that I think about it, I feel like RE3 needs these fiery personalities to match the over-the-top, non-stop action thriller that is that game. And RE2 needs the wide-eyed naivety of Leon and Claire to convey the realness and static dread of the situation. So you know what? I think as I was scripting this, I realized that I don't actually hate Leon and Claire as much as I thought I did. It makes sense that they're kind of dopey. Like, they're young, impressionable kids compared to 2 battle-hardened, trained professionals in a nightmare scenario where they literally don't know anybody or anything about what's going on. You and I would probably be speechless too, and a little bit of a dummy as well. So as I said before, These games take place in the same city at different times in certain points, right? A little bit of 3 happens, and then all of 2, and then 3 again. And strangely, these games hardly overlap except for once, at the most iconic location across both games. The reason I wanted to give this iconic obelisk its own section is because this is the only place where both games blend together seamlessly. In RE2, just like the original, you play as whoever's campaign you chose at the start, Leon or Claire, and play the RPD section as either one, never switching between the two. In RE3, you take control of Carlos for the entirety of your time in the RPD, rather than explore it as Jill like in the original. One of my favorite things about this place across both games is how the RPD is a hub of activity. It has so much personality, so many significant story beats happen in or around here that it seems like a character in and of itself. Even walking up, there are more open graves outside upon Carlos's earlier arrival, and as Leon there are less plots. As Carlos, you find Leon's uniform in the lockers downstairs. And I love how in 3, we find out how Marvin got fatally wounded, making the weight behind this delivery that much heavier when you understand the context.
And don't make my mistake. If you see one of those things, uniform or not, you do not hesitate. You take it out, or you run. Got it?
Yes, sir.
I love how it was Carlos that blew a hole in the shower room wall and Leon finds it later. I love how in that same shower room, Carlos finds the officer's note and doesn't open the locker, and Leon foolishly does and gets spooked. I love how the officers in the hallway from 2 are shown perishing in 3. The RPD is also the one location that made me realize what I like about 3 is something I didn't really like about 2. In 2, Claire and Leon do the exact same thing in the exact same order in the RPD regardless of campaign scenario. In 3, you switch to Carlos when Jill is incapacitated in some way, making them feel like real separate characters as opposed to the same gameplay puppet with different skins. Another overall difference in both games as a whole is runtime. Both games' main campaigns are short relative to their original counterparts, but they're packed with bonus content that encourages repeat playthroughs. One thing about 2 though, I got really tired of RPD in 2. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but I mean, I'm all for a vast sprawling map full of like, you know, items and collectibles and locked doors and shit. But once you neutralize all of the undead, kill all the monsters, and like figure out how Mr. X works, RPD gets kind of boring. By the time you unlock the secret room in the center of the main hall, you're much less excited about the new area and more happy to just be getting the hell out of a map you've squeezed of all its possible resources. In RE3, you don't spend a second longer than you need to here, and I love that, considering how over half the game takes place in the RPD in 2, and 3 moves at a much faster pace as a whole. Carlos is a merc through and through. You get in, you get what you need, and you get out, all with just enough time to develop moments that are of great significance in the previous game. There's a sense of stability here in 3 that isn't there in 2 because of when everything happens in each game respectively. The RPD in 3, since Carlos gets there before Leon, looks a little bit more intact, whereas by the time Leon gets there, it's almost totally abandoned and a complete mess. It's a detail I'm happy was included, but there's one element to both of these games that sees some pretty distinct differences and disappointing similarities. Both Resident Evil 2 and 3 Remake implement a menacing killer AI that stalks you throughout the game. In Resident Evil 2, Mr. X remains pretty terrifying for the majority of the game because you can't kill him until the very end. He actively stalks you through the entire game and can kill you in as little as one single punch depending on your health upon encountering him. It's a pretty sophisticated AI that was really impressive and nerve-wracking on my first playthrough, and the same can be said for his presence in the original Resident Evil 2. In the original Resident Evil 3, however, this is also true of Nemesis, but they turned this up tenfold. He can pop out on you at completely random, unscripted parts of the game, cut you off in alleyways, has multiple melee attacks, a small arsenal of projectile weapons, tentacles that grab you and pull you in from long distances, and he can basically like frame trap you in a corner until you die. Almost none of this is true of Remake Nemesis. Mr. X in the remake takes everything terrifying about Mr. X in the original, slaps a graphical overhaul and modern mechanics on it, and it works. You have the perfect overarching threat in an already horrifying situation. It's pretty brilliant. actually. Nemesis in the remake seems to take a step back from this, and it's almost entirely the fault of Resident Evil 3's dependency on its script. Nemesis is almost tethered to the script, whereas the original Nemesis was something you always needed to keep in mind because he could pop out unscripted at any moment, like Mr. X in both iterations of the previous game. Even if you dispatched every zombie, every dog, every monster in the city, and in the RPD, you were never ever really safe. You were always on your toes because Nemesis or Mr. X could be around any corner. In the remake, I burned every single head muncher and moseyed on down the streets with ease because Nemesis didn't pop out on me unscripted at all. Like, not once in the entire game. I mean, I did play on standard the first time, so that probably has something to do with it. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if he popped out more for you depending on the difficulty. If you down him, he still drops valuable weapons cases like in the original, so they at least kept that, but the exclusion of the random encounters was a real bummer for me. This is Resident Evil. You should never feel entirely safe like I did throughout a lot of this game. So in the past, I've put gameplay, mechanics, and controls in separate categories, but I think from now on, I'm going to put them all into one talking point because they all kind of go hand in hand anyway, and you can't really have one without the other. So as far as all of these things are concerned, though, you know, they're pretty standout, pretty stellar, and, you know, very impressive across the board for both games. The relatively new RE engine looks just as fantastic in 3 as it did in 2 as it did in 7, with a major difference being the enemy behavior and damage degradation. In 2, zombies shamble around like they're literally carrying their own dead weight, and animations vary depending on where they're shot, the distance the shot travels, and the effect of the damage done. Zombies will stumble and ragdoll their way to the floor, and limbs will literally crumble and fall apart specifically where you shoot. A lot of this is gone for the most part in 3 because of how taxing it is on the engine. Let me explain. A game engine is the digital workspace that allows you to construct the actual video game, right? So think of it like space on a desk. The more space you take up on that desk, the less space you have for more stuff. Resident Evil 2 can afford to have these wonderfully detailed animations and degradation system because the environment isn't as taxing as it is in RE3. Resident Evil 2 takes place in quiet and static environments relative to RE3. Nemesis, the increase in enemies, the much richer sound, and the constant moving environment, it draws a lot of the engine's resources, and, you know, that's why I don't really have a problem with this. That's why the zombies don't behave the same. And, you know, you're kind of being a brat when you condemn a game for this, you know, major downgrade without first considering all of these facts. I'm not going to go too much into graphics because that's where the RE engine shines, in my opinion. It stands out as spectacular to me in this regard, and the game looks objectively incredible, as did its predecessor. However, some textures and shaders take a hit on smaller monitors because of how the game chooses to process and like pixelate these images. And on 4K TVs, if you have HDR settings, just don't use it. All it does is wash out the darkness and like kind of ruin the atmosphere of the game. As far as other gameplay mechanics and controls, I like how this time around the knife is a dedicated weapon instead of an item you have to keep finding when your last one depletes. One downside to this though is that there's no way to escape an encounter with a zombie. In 2, if you get grabbed and you have grenades, flashbangs, or knives on you, you can actually avoid taking any damage by shoving one of the aforementioned items into its head or mouth. In 3, this whole mechanic is gone and replaced with a quick time event that sees you taking less damage the faster you complete it, but taking damage nonetheless. 3 introduces a mechanic unseen in 2, but returning from the original, which is the dodge or dodge roll, features present in the original game, but just as unreliable. I've only played through the game twice, okay, so maybe that's just me being a scrub, but it's like really hard to tell when the right moment to dodge is. Like if you dodge too early, you'll get stuck in like a recovery animation, and then the zombies are gonna grab you anyway and you're gonna take damage. If you dodge too late, it won't fucking read the input, it won't do it, right? So the zombie grabs you and you take damage anyway. So I honestly tried to rely on this mechanic as little as possible. I mean, it's a great inclusion, don't get me wrong, and going back to RE2 and not having it was definitely worse than having it and having it work sometimes. So, you know, I just wish it was a little better. But again, maybe that's just me, you know? Maybe I just need to get good. Speaking of getting good, upon beating both 2 and 3, I have very different attitudes after each experience. And here's why. So remember when I said that Resident Evil 2 was the whole reason I wanted to start this segment last year, and I'd explain why later? Well, this is later, and let me explain. I enjoyed Resident Evil 2 a lot last year. As I said before, it's in my top 10 games of all time, and it's one of 2 Resident Evil titles on that list, the only series that appears twice on my list at all, actually. I love it so much, in fact, that I found myself playing it and replaying it for a little over a month and thought, yo, the fact that I'm getting so much out of this game, despite buying it over a month ago, is amazing. I should probably do some kind of like segment or review or something. And here we are. Resident Evil 2 was supposed to be the first game I did in this segment. You know, things didn't really work out that way. Life kind of just happened. So I get to do it now. The post game in RE2 is amazing. Sure, the second run stuff is just the cheap shell of the old A and B scenarios, but that's really the only downside here. Resident Evil has always been great at packing their games with bonus content once you're done with the main campaign, and Resident Evil 2 is no exception. Once you beat the main campaign, you unlock that character's second run scenario, which is admittedly hardly worth doing. It's literally the same campaign all over again with a couple of things moved around and a few cutscenes slightly altered. Beyond that, you unlock the higher difficulties, fourth survivor mode where you play as Hunk, a seemingly unkillable, unstoppable Umbrella operative who was sent in to retrieve the G-Virus. Fourth survivor tofu mode, where it's the same thing, you just play as various blocks of tofu with different loadouts. It's actually kind of funny. It includes regular tofu, konjac, mochi, anin tofu, and fucking flan. They got flan in the game, you heard? Oíste. Así que para todos los dominicanos tienen flan en el juego. Para que no digan que no lo incluyeron en algo. There was, of course, the Ghost Survivor DLC later on, but as far as post-game included unlockable content, this game is no slouch, and it really made my $60 purchase feel justified. The same cannot be said for Resident Evil 3, however. Now, again, remember, I'm judging these games based on what they offered when they came out. I'm not saying, hey, this is Resident Evil 2 a year and a half later compared to Resident Evil 3 a month later. No, that's not what I'm doing. It's a comparison of both games as they stand when they came out. And also a review of RE3 a month later. And also a review of RE2 a year and a half, like whatever. The game is just over 5 hours and a little under 7 if you take your time and take things slow, but upon your first playthrough, you'll find a real downgrade in post-game content. Once you beat the game once, you get one costume. Jill's old Spencer Mansion getup. Which, by the way, if the game is any indication, she's fucking traumatized by those events. Why would she ever wear that again? Sorry. I don't mean to Dartigan this shit up. I know that's pretentious and stupid. I will never do that, by the way. You will never catch me sinning anything. That is fucking dumb, and you need to get a hobby and actually get good at stuff. Find a trade, maybe learn something, maybe be useful, instead of, you know, cinema sinsing your way to fucking success, you bozo. Anyway, you only get Jill's old Spencer Mansion getup, and the only other costumes are pre-order exclusive, so all we get for now is this, and an in-game point system used to unlock various game-breaking upgrades that make for a pretty satisfying run, I'm not gonna lie, but I mean, really? Like, that's it? I don't know, like no mercenaries mode, not even a little time trial, like, you know, just an option to play the same game again a little harder, and then the same game again a little harder, and then play the same game again for points to play the same game again just a little broken. Due to the lack of random encounters and different treatment of Nemesis, they've done away with a beloved mechanic from the old game, which were the live in-game choices when you run into him. Basically, whenever you were faced with Nemesis, the game gave you one of 2 choices. That choice then affected the direction the story goes in, albeit in a minor fashion, but still. This gave you a sense of autonomy and made for interesting outcomes to specific scenarios. It was a pretty cool way to spice things up and give you an incentive to play it again and make whatever choices you didn't make the first time and see how it would play out differently. None of that is here now. It's quite literally the same game over and over. No other modes, no other choices, nothing like the last game. Look, do I want RE3 to be a copy of its predecessor? No. And I realize that that's what a lot of these reviews sound like. All the criticism I've seen on here usually boils down to, this sucks, it's not like 2, or this sucks, it's not like the original. And, you know, I don't want 3 to be like 2. I don't even want 3 to be like 3. I just would have liked for 3 to take the good things about the original 3 and the good things about Resident Evil 2 remake and expand upon them instead of just straight up like cutting stuff, you know? And but speaking of cutting stuff, I purposely left out the clock tower and the park sequence because they're not that important. Okay, the clock tower was cool or whatever. The park was kind of annoying. Whatever. I mean, I guess people use it to argue that the game is too short and the inclusion of those things would have, you know, made the game longer or whatever. But what's the point? Why do you want padding in the game? Like, they took them shits out and I didn't even fucking notice. Get over it. But anyway, what is the verdict? Survey says... So in this segment, I usually cap the whole video off with a short suggestion to those who haven't played the game, and I tell you whether or not it's worth your time. In short, yes. Both these games are absolutely worth your time and attention. Resident Evil 2 in particular is definitely worth full price in my opinion. But until we get some free DLC or something, man, Resident Evil 3 should not have been $60, bro. Like, as low as 40 or maybe 50, like, tops. But this was not a $60 game. Oh, and because of the particular structure of this particular episode, I didn't hit two particular points that I do in all my other reviews, and that's target audience and runtime. But, you know, as I was writing, I realized that it made perfect sense to kind of just throw those in here at the end in my verdict. So as far as runtime, anyone who has even seen anyone play this fucking game or talk about it knows that it's short. Okay, the game is short. This is not news to anyone. They're both kind of short, actually, now that I think about it. 3 is definitely shorter than 2, and some might argue maybe even too short compared to their original counterparts, and I agree, but I also don't disagree with the decision to make them shorter. A game being short doesn't make it bad, and neither of these games are anything close to a bad time, and I feel like you guys always falsely equate the two. And I don't know about y'all, but I'd much rather play a really good short game and replay that experience than be bored to death with a game that was way longer than it needed to be. That's all. There's not really much more to that. As far as target audience, Resident Evil 2 and 3 are similar enough to share a franchise, but their audiences are definitely going to be split down the middle. Resident Evil 2 is a much more claustrophobic, tense, chilling experience, and is tailored more to the survival horror fan, whereas Resident Evil 3 is more of the action thriller variety and meant for fans of, like, I don't know, fucking Fast and Furious and zombies. I don't know. Neither of these things is better or worse than the other. And to argue that 2 is more Resident Evil is dumb and elitist, okay? Straight up. It's just fucking stupid. It's dumb, elitist garbage, kind of like tank controls. 3 is just as much Resident Evil as 2. Yes, 3 is action heavy, okay, but so was the coveted Resident Evil 4 and 5 and 6. Like it or not, they're all Resident Evil, okay? And just because 3 employs the parts of the franchise that you don't like or that you deem low points doesn't make that any less true. So do I recommend these titles? Do I even like these games after complaining about them for so long? I think that this very long video and the exhaustion in my face makes for a pretty resounding yes. I personally liked each game for its own reasons, but like most people, I do prefer 2 over 3 because, you know, after all, this is 1 month later, and we hold games up by their merits and playability in that amount of time. 2 is worth full price any way you slice it, in my opinion, because you're going to be playing it for a long time. The campaign is longer than 3's, and the unlockable post-game content is definitely worth the effort, and it's replayable as hell, and it's almost always on sale now. A game I paid $60 for a year ago with no DLC is now never any more than $40 complete with everything on any digital platform. 3 is absolutely not worth full price as of right now, okay? It's been a month since release and no free DLC or unlockable modes in sight. Again, short doesn't always equal bad, but for a game as short and as linear as this, $60 is kind of asking for a lot. I'd wait till some DLC drops and it's bundled together or the prices drop or something, because there isn't enough here for me to confidently recommend Resident Evil 3 at full price a month later. Which is ironic considering I absolutely think Resident Evil 2 is worth full price almost a year and a half later. Anyway, thank you guys so much for sticking around for all this. Resident Evil is my favorite franchise, and I just hope I did it justice and was able to inform you, at least some of you, and help guide your decision to either play or skip out on these titles. Resident Evil, for all its highs and lows, still is and forever will be one of the most important video game franchises of all time. And hopefully Capcom learns from its mistakes and you know, take some steps in the right direction with the rumored Resident Evil 8. And don't worry, I'll be sure to make a 1 month later for that too. Until next time, thank you guys. Tank controls suck.